"Ma'am, I think you're lost," the sergeant said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the ship's ventilation. He gave her a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "The civilian dependent lounge is 3 decks up. It's easy to get turned around down here." Doris Campbell stopped. She was of average height, her frame softened by age, but her posture was a ramrod. Decades of discipline had carved themselves into her spine. She held a simple visitor's pass in a hand mapped with the fine lines of a long life, the knuckles slightly swollen. Her eyes, a pale, clear blue, met his without a flicker. "I'm not lost, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was calm, a low timbred instrument that carried without effort. The sergeant's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Right. Well, this is a restricted area for operational personnel. Who are you here to see?" "I can have someone escort you to your husband or son." "I'm not visiting anyone," Doris replied, her patience as smooth and unyielding as a river stone. "I'm here for the martial arts demonstration on the flight deck." The specialist behind the sergeant let out a short, muffled snort. The staff sergeant Miller crossed his arms. The condescension in his gaze was palpable. He looked her up and down, from the sensible flat shoes to the elegant but utterly out-of-place jacket. He saw a grandmother, a frail civilian who had wandered into the machinery of war and was now gumming up the works. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's a training event for active-duty soldiers and Marines," he said, his tone slow and deliberate, as if speaking to a child. "It's a physical thing. You wouldn't be interested, and you certainly don't have the clearance to be here." He gestured to her visitor's pass. "Let me see that." Doris held it out. He snatched it from her hand, his eyes scanning the laminate. He scoffed. "Guest of the MEU, Commander? I think there's been a mistake at reception. Let me just call this in." He pulled out a radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. The bottleneck in the passageway was growing. Sailors and soldiers slowed, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the young, aggressive NCO confronting the serene old woman. Doris simply waited, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She had been standing at attention, in one form or another, for most of her life. A few more minutes would make no difference. "Look, Grandma," Miller said, dropping the pretense of respect. "This ship is not a cruise liner. We have rules, we have procedures. You can't just wander around wherever you want." He tapped the pass against his palm. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. We'll get this sorted out with the master-at-arms." Doris's gaze remained fixed on him. "You're making a mistake, Staff Sergeant. The only mistake here was letting you get this far," he retorted. "Now are you coming peacefully, or do I need to get an escort?" The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. The crowd of onlookers shuffled, some looking uncomfortable, others entertained by the drama. Miller seemed to swell with the attention, his authority validated by the audience. He was the gatekeeper, the enforcer of rules, and this confused old woman was his perfect foil. He saw her as a disruption, a problem to be managed. He did not see the calloused pads on her fingertips, a relic of a lifetime spent mastering the trigger pull of a rifle. He did not see the subtle, balanced way she stood, her weight distributed perfectly, ready to shift and move with an economy born of a million repetitions. He saw a tweed jacket and gray hair. He saw a target for his petty power. "My pass is valid," Doris stated, her voice still level. "It was issued this morning. If you check with the Marine Expeditionary Unit's command office, you will find my name on the access roster." Miller laughed, a short barking sound. "The MEU commander is a colonel. You really expect me to believe she personally invited you to a combat training exercise? What are you, her favorite aunt? Let's go." He took a step forward, his intent clear. "I am on this vessel at the specific invitation of Colonel Rostova," Doris said, her patience finally fraying, not with anger but with a weary sense of inevitability. "I am here to observe and provide a historical brief for her Marines." "A historical brief," Miller repeated, looking back at his specialist for affirmation. "On what?" "Knitting patterns from the 70s. Come on, we're done here." He continued to scrutinize her pass, shaking his head. "The date on your ID looks faded. The photo is ancient. I'm not even sure this is you. For all I know, this is a security breach." He was building his case, speaking to the crowd as much as to her. He was establishing himself as the vigilant NCO protecting the ship from a potential threat. Every word was a layer of justification, an escalation of his own making. He was so focused on the image of the woman before him that he failed to read the text. He saw the name Doris Campbell, but it meant nothing to him. It was just a name. He didn't notice the way she held her ground, not with aggression but with a deep, immovable stillness, like a mountain that had weathered 1,000 storms and was unimpressed by a spring squall. Inside her jacket pocket, her fingers found the familiar worn edges of a small, heavy coin. It was smooth in some places, sharp in others, the details on its face all but erased by time and touch. The cold metal was a conduit to another lifetime. The memory was sharp, smelling of dust and sun-scorched earth. 29 Palms, decades ago. She was a sergeant then, wiry and tough, the only woman in a platoon of hardened instructors. The sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering haze. They were on the final day of a grueling advanced marksmanship course. The last drill was the toughest, a stress shoot involving a half-mile run in full gear followed by a series of precision shots at diminishing targets. The men, bigger and stronger, had burned out on the run, their breathing ragged, their shots straying. She had paced herself, her lungs burning, but her rhythm steady. She arrived at the firing line, dropped into a perfect prone position, controlled her breathing as she had been taught, and methodically, calmly, put every single round in the black. Her instructor, a grizzled master sergeant with a face like a leather map, had watched her without expression. That evening, he'd pressed this very coin into her palm. It wasn't a fancy unit coin. It was his own, a simple brass token from his time in a place he never spoke of. "You don't shoot like a girl," he had grunted, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. "You shoot like a Marine." The coin was a reminder. Respect was never given freely. It was earned. It was taken. It was forged in sweat and performance. One round, one drill, one grueling day at a time. The young man standing before her now had no concept of that currency. He dealt in the flimsy paper of assumptions. On the edge of the growing cluster of onlookers, a Navy Command Master Chief named Franklin paused. He was a plank owner on 3 different ships, his face a testament to a life spent at sea. He was trying to get to the mess deck, and this impromptu theater in the middle of the P-way was an irritation. He pushed his way forward a few steps, ready to use his rank to disperse the crowd. Then he heard the name. "Doris Campbell," Staff Sergeant Miller said with theatrical exasperation. "I'm taking you to the Master-at-Arms right now." The name snagged in Master Chief Franklin's memory. Campbell. It wasn't common, but it wasn't the name itself. It was the context. Marines. He peered past a young sailor's shoulder and saw the woman. Old, yes, but the way she stood, it was familiar. It was the rigid, unwavering posture of a senior enlisted Marine. He'd seen it 1,000 times on the decks of amphibious ships. His eyes narrowed. He saw the tweed jacket, but he also saw the spine of steel beneath it. Then he saw it. As she shifted her weight slightly, the cuff of her jacket rode up an inch, revealing a small, faded tattoo just above her wrist bone. It was blurry with age, the ink softened and spread, but it was unmistakable, an eagle, globe and anchor. It was the old style, the one you saw on Vietnam-era and Cold War vets, and then it all crashed into place. Master Guns Campbell. The stories came flooding back. He'd been a young petty officer on the USS Pliliu in the late 90s. The embarked MIU had a legend in its ranks, a female master gunnery sergeant in the infantry training field, a rarity so profound she was practically a myth, a master instructor in the new martial arts program they were developing, a shooting champion who routinely outshot the Force Recon guys. They called her the Iron Maiden, not with malice but with a deep, abiding awe. She was tough, fair, and utterly terrifying on the rifle range. He'd seen her once, dressing down a young captain for a safety violation with such surgical precision that the officer could only nod and stammer apologies. The idea that this soldier, this child, was threatening to detain her, it was so absurd it was almost funny. Almost. But the disrespect was a violation that set his teeth on edge. This wasn't just an old woman. This was Marine Corps royalty. Franklin didn't hesitate. He backed away from the crowd, his movements swift and sure. He found a quieter alcove next to a ladder well, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts. He found the number he was looking for, the direct line to the MEU commander's staff. He didn't bother with the sergeant major. This required an officer's intervention. A young Marine lieutenant answered. "This is Command Master Chief Franklin of the Essex," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Get me Colonel Rostova, right now. It's an operational imperative." There was a pause. "Sir, the colonel is in a planning brief." "Lieutenant, I don't think you heard me," Franklin cut in, his voice dropping into a register that could peel paint. "There is an Army Staff Sergeant down in P-Way 3, forward of the hangar bay, who is currently harassing a guest of your commander. Her name is Doris Campbell. You tell the colonel that name and you tell her that Master Guns Campbell is about to be arrested by the Army. Now move." He hung up, the silence in the alcove a stark contrast to the storm brewing just a few yards away. He had lit the fuse. Now he could only wait for the explosion. Inside the flag country section of the ship, where the senior officers commanded the MEU, Colonel Eva Rostova was leading a complex discussion on amphibious landing logistics. Maps, charts, and digital overlays filled the screens around the conference table. She was sharp, focused, a commander in her element. Her aide, a young first lieutenant, approached her hesitantly and placed a small note in front of her. Rostova glanced down, her brow furrowing in annoyance at the interruption. The note contained 4 lines. CMC Franklin, urgent P-Way 3. Army NCO harassing your guest, Doris Campbell, threatening to detain Master Guns Campbell. The colonel's expression shifted through 3 distinct phases in less than 2 seconds. First confusion, then a dawning horrified recognition. Finally, a mask of cold, controlled fury descended over her features. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The officers seated at the table fell silent, sensing the sudden seismic shift in their commander's attention. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Colonel Rostova said, her voice dangerously calm. She stood up, her movements precise. "Lieutenant, pull up the visitor manifest for today. Cross-reference with the Marine Corps retired personnel database. I want everything you have on Master Gunnery Sergeant Doris L. Campbell. Put it on my monitor. Now." She walked to her desk at the head of the room as the lieutenant's fingers flew across the keyboard. A file appeared on the large screen. It was a life distilled into data points and official photographs. A young woman with fierce eyes in a service uniform from the 1980s, a hardened sergeant in desert camouflage, her face smudged with dirt, a stern-faced gunnery sergeant, and on, the rank on her collar climbing with each photo. Then came the text. Decades of service. Deployments to every major conflict and contingency operation since the Cold War. Commendations, medals, letters of appreciation. But it was the qualifications that made the room go silent. Distinguished rifleman, distinguished pistol shot, 7th degree black belt instructor, Marine Corps martial arts program, senior cadre, division schools, weapons training battalion. The list went on and on. Attached were notes from former commanding officers, colonels and generals, men who were now legends in their own right. They all said the same thing in different ways. She was the standard. She was the bedrock. "Sergeant Major," Colonel Rostova said, her voice like cracking ice. Her Sergeant Major, a man who looked like he had been carved from granite, materialized at her side. "Ma'am, we're going for a walk," she said. "Pass the word. I want Staff Sergeant Miller of the Army's 503rd Attachment to meet me in P-Way 3. Immediately." Back in the passageway, Miller's patience had finally evaporated. The old woman's quiet defiance was making him look weak. The crowd was growing, and he could feel their judgment. He had to end this. "All right, that's it. You've been warned," he declared, his voice rising. "You are a security risk. Your credentials are old, likely fraudulent, and you refuse to comply with a lawful order. You probably don't even remember the current procedures for base access. It happens when you get older." He reached out, his hand aiming for her elbow. "You are coming with me." He was pushing past the point of no return, his arrogance a blinding light that obscured all reason. He was about to lay hands on her. Doris didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply watched his hand approach, her expression unreadable. But before his fingers could touch the sleeve of her tweed jacket, a voice sliced through the passageway, sharp and cold and loud enough to rattle the pipes overhead. "Staff Sergeant." The word was a physical blow. Miller froze, his hand hovering in midair. The crowd, which had been a chaotic mass, seemed to part like the Red Sea. Striding down the center of the newly formed aisle was Colonel Eva Rostova. She was in her camouflage utility uniform, sleeves neatly rolled, a black eagle insignia glinting on each collar point. Flanking her was her Sergeant Major, a mountain of a man whose glare alone could make a grown man cry. Behind them were 2 more Marines from her command staff. They moved with a predatory grace, their eyes sweeping the scene, taking in the cocky Army NCO, the nervous specialist, and the old woman in the blue jacket. The atmosphere in the passageway transformed instantly. The low murmur of voices died. Sailors and soldiers snapped to a semblance of attention, their eyes wide. Miller felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove. He tried to straighten his uniform, his face paling. Colonel Rostova ignored him completely. She walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture, and came to a halt directly in front of Doris Campbell. For a moment, the 2 women just looked at each other. The active duty colonel at the peak of her power, and the retired master gunnery sergeant who had forged the path she now walked upon. Then Colonel Rostova's boots snapped together. She brought her hand up in a salute so sharp, so precise it could have cut glass. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Campbell." The colonel's voice rang with a profound, unwavering respect. "It is an absolute honor to have you aboard my ship, ma'am." The sergeant major followed suit, his own massive hand coming up in a salute that was just as crisp. "An honor, Master Guns," he rumbled. The sound of Miller's jaw hitting the deck was almost audible. His specialist looked like he was about to faint. The crowd was a sea of stunned faces. They had all been watching a sitcom and it had suddenly turned into a state ceremony. Colonel Rostova dropped her salute and turned, her gaze finally falling upon Staff Sergeant Miller. It was not a warm gaze. It was the look a biologist gives a specimen under a microscope just before dissecting it. "Staff Sergeant Miller," she began, her voice deceptively soft, "allow me to provide you with the historical brief that you seem to be so desperately in need of." She took a half step to the side, creating a clear line of sight between the crowd and Doris. "For those of you who do not know," the colonel's voice rose, projecting down the length of the passageway, "you are standing in the presence of a living legend of the United States Marine Corps. This is Master Gunnery Sergeant Doris Campbell, retired." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the older sailors and Marines nodded slowly, the name finally clicking into place. The younger ones just looked confused, then intrigued. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Campbell served for 32 years, Rostova continued, her words painting a picture of a life lived in service. "She was a marksmanship instructor at Paris Island when most of your parents were still in high school. She holds the 5th highest rifle qualification score ever recorded by a female Marine. She was one of the first women selected to become a formal instructor in close quarters combat, and she was instrumental in developing the very martial arts program that you were on your way to watch. Sergeant." She paused, letting the words sink in. Miller was visibly shrinking, his face a mottled red and white. When women were not officially allowed in combat roles, she was attached to units in Panama, in the Balkans, and during the First Gulf War, serving in liaison and training roles that somehow always seemed to happen where the fighting was thickest. She has trained more than 10,000 Marines in her career, lieutenants and lance corporals, captains and gunnery sergeants, many of whom went on to become colonels and sergeant majors. She glanced meaningfully at the man beside her, who gave a solemn nod. "The women in uniform you see today," Rostova said, her voice softening slightly as she looked at some of the young female soldiers and Marines in the crowd. "The opportunities you have to serve in any role, to lead, to command, those opportunities were bought and paid for. They were paid for by women like Master Guns Campbell, who had to be twice as good, twice as tough, and 10 times as smart just to be considered equal. She didn't just meet the standard, for 3 decades she was the standard." The passageway was utterly silent now, save for the hum of the ship. The onlookers were no longer a curious mob. They were a congregation. The young soldiers who had been snickering with Miller now looked at the floor in shame. The young Marines, especially the women, stared at Doris with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. They were looking at one of the architects of their world. Finally, Rostova turned her full attention back to Miller. The rebuke, when it came, was not loud, but it was devastating. "You, Staff Sergeant, did not see a Marine. You did not see a 32-year veteran. You did not even bother to properly verify the credentials of a guest of this command. You saw an old woman in a tweed jacket, and you made an assumption. You assumed she was weak. You assumed she was confused. You assumed she was less than you. In the profession of arms, assumptions like that get people killed. On my ship, they get you removed." She gestured to her sergeant major. "See to it that Staff Sergeant Miller and his specialist report to their company commander. They are confined to their berthing until further notice. Their access to this vessel is under review." As the sergeant major stepped forward, Doris held up a hand. "Colonel, if I may." Rostova nodded. "The deck is yours, Master Guns." Doris stepped forward, her pale blue eyes finding Miller's. There was no anger in them, only a profound, weary disappointment. "Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the space, "the colonel is right. You judged a book by its cover. But let me tell you something I learned over 30 years. The uniform changes. The hair goes gray. The body gets slower. But the standard does not change. The threat does not change. A threat doesn't care if you're 19 or 69. It only cares if you are prepared. Experience doesn't expire with youth. Don't soften the standard. Just learn to apply it fairly, to everyone." As she spoke about the unyielding nature of a true standard, a final vivid image flashed through her mind. It was not a memory of glory, but of grit, a nighttime raid in a dusty, forgotten corner of the world, the acrid smell of cordite and fear, a young Marine, no older than Specialist Kent, his rifle jammed, his face a mask of panic. She had moved to him under fire, her movements calm and economical. She didn't speak. She just took the weapon, and in the strobing green light of night vision, her hands, sure and practiced, cleared the stoppage in 3 seconds and slapped the rifle back into his grasp. She hadn't been a man or a woman in that moment. She hadn't been old or young. She had been the one person in that chaotic alley who knew exactly what to do. She had been the standard. The sergeant major gently but firmly took Miller by the arm, and the two soldiers were led away, their heads bowed in a state of utter humiliation. The crowd began to disperse, the sailors and soldiers speaking in hushed, reverent tones. Colonel Rostova turned back to Doris. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Campbell, I cannot apologize enough for the disrespect you were shown." "It's all right, Colonel," Doris said with a small, tired smile. "It's not the first time. It probably won't be the last. It just means the work isn't done yet." Later that day, on the sun-blasted, wind-whipped flight deck of the USS Essex, the MEU's martial arts demonstration was underway. Marines in full combat gear slammed each other into the deck, their movements a brutal ballet. The guest of honor, Doris Campbell, sat next to Colonel Rostova. At the end of the demonstration, the colonel stood. "Marines, we have a guest today who helped write the book on what you've just seen. Master Gunnery Sergeant Campbell, would you be willing to demonstrate for us?" A ripple of excitement went through the assembled Marines. Doris smiled, stood up and removed her tweed jacket, revealing a simple blouse. She walked onto the mats. The lead instructor, a powerful young gunnery sergeant built like a vending machine, respectfully bowed to her. "Show me a knife defense, Gunny," Doris said calmly. The gunny lunged, his movements a blur of speed and power, the rubber training knife slashing toward her. What happened next was too fast for most to follow. Doris didn't block the attack. She flowed with it. She moved a half step, redirecting his momentum. Her hand, a blur of motion, secured his wrist. A twist of her body, a shift of her hips, and the giant Marine was suddenly airborne. He landed flat on his back with a loud thud, the wind knocked out of him, the knife skittering across the mat. Doris stood over him, not even breathing hard. A moment of stunned silence, and then the flight deck erupted in thunderous applause. That evening, as the sun set over the vast expanse of the Pacific, Doris stood by the ship's railing, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. She heard footsteps approach and turned to see Staff Sergeant Miller. He looked smaller without his bluster. He came to a halt a few feet away, not meeting her eyes. "Ma'am, Master Gunnery Sergeant, I came to apologize. What I did today was inexcusable. There's no other word for it. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I'm sorry." Doris looked at him for a long moment, then nodded toward the railing. "Come here, Sergeant." He stepped up beside her. They stood in silence for a minute, the only sound the wind and the sea. "Years ago," Doris said, her voice soft, "I was a brand new sergeant. I had a young Marine in my charge. He was skinny, clumsy, couldn't shoot straight, couldn't march in time. I wrote him off. I saw a failure. I treated him like one. One day, during a land navigation exercise, our team leader went down with heat stroke. We were lost. Panic started to set in. And that skinny, clumsy kid, turns out he'd grown up in the mountains of West Virginia. He could read the land like a book. He got us all back safe. He wasn't a bad Marine. I was just a bad leader, because I was only looking for the type of strength I understood." She turned to face him. "You made a mistake today, Sergeant. A bad one. Now you have a choice. You can let it make you bitter, or you can let it make you better. You can let it teach you to see the person, not the package." Miller finally met her eyes. He saw no condemnation, only a challenge. He nodded, a lump in his throat. "I understand, ma'am. Thank you." He rendered a slow, formal salute. Doris Campbell, the old woman in the tweed jacket, the living legend of the Marine Corps, returned it with the timeless, perfect precision that had defined her entire life. If this story of a Marine Corps legend reminded you that heroes come in all shapes, sizes, and ages, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And for more stories of incredible women who chose a life of service and valor, make sure you subscribe to our channel.